Hi, I'm Penny Pullen and I'm here with Helen Winter. Helen is an author and consultant who has both written RFPs, requests for proposals, but also been involved in responding to them over many years. And she's going to take a bit of time today just to help you. If you're about to write an RFP or in the middle of it, then her insights should be really useful for you. So Helen, tell us a little bit more about your involvement in the RFP process.
Okay, so I've written many RFPs for companies, and I've also responded to them as well. So um, there's certain things I've learned when writing RFPs, where you want to be able to, at the end of it, you want to be able to understand which is the best vendor for the service or product that you're asking for. And one of the major headaches is you can write an RFP, and then when you get all the responses, it's then how do you work out which is the best one? How do you make sure that the process is fair, that you've got clear evaluation criteria, that you can compare like for like? And that's one of the biggest problems that I've found. And especially when I respond to RFPs, is that sometimes you can tell the companies that are more experienced than those that aren't, because you just know that by the way they've done it, whether they're going to find it easy to make a decision from it. So I thought that would be one of the things I've written about in my book, and one of the things that I offer as a service, because once you've got that experience and understand what the pitfalls and what to avoid, it makes it a lot easier, because that's one of the things. You get a lot of people that are really invested into wanting to make sure they've got the best product and service, and it can be very difficult, especially when you've got people in different teams that have different opinions, and how do you bring it together to get an objective decision, or a decision that you can actually justify? And that's the biggest problems that I think that a lot of people have.
So essentially, is that the purpose of an RFP and why you have one, to get that really clear?
Yeah, so it's to make sure that you'll clearly articulate what you want the what companies to respond to, and also to make sure you know what your evaluation criteria is, so that you know how you're going to pick. Is it purely based on cost? Is it based on the relationship that you have with the vendor? How easy you think they are to work with? Is it going to be based on, can they meet all of your requirements? There's a whole host of things. Sometimes there can be several vendors that can meet all of your requirements, and what do you do then? What's going to be important to you. So yeah, it's making sure that you do go about it in a certain way. One of the best techniques that I've found is to make sure that you ask for vendors to respond in the same format. So the best technique I've found is by give them the information so they know what the requirements are, but asking them all exactly the same questions, and asking them to respond to exactly the same questions, because then that makes it a lot easier to compare the vendors. One of the things that I've noticed is sometimes they just say, just write a response, and they don't give you any format at all. And I just feel so sorry for the people that are then going to try and mark it, because it's just going to be so difficult, where if you get everybody to respond for every single question, you can then make sure that you can compare. And then the other thing is to give each question a weighting. Set up, if you're writing an RFP, decide who your evaluation team are, who are going to make that decision on who gets who to pick. Make sure you get the evaluation team organised in advance, meetings set up in advance, so that they can actually run with it. So another common scenario I come across is you get companies saying, "Oh, we'll do it by these really aggressive dates," but then they can't, because they haven't taken into account some of their key decision makers have gone away for 2 weeks. So
Oh
it's
dear.
important to, who is going to be in my evaluation team, get the meetings in the calendar in advance, get people agreed to come to them, and to get people to agree in advance the weighting for each of the questions you want answered. So some things are going to be more important to you than others. So if you can do those things in advance, it's just going to make the process so much easier.
And fairer, because if you do it later on, then you probably have people might have an idea of the one they want, and that could skew everything, couldn't it?
Yeah, and that often happens. And sometimes what you find is the situation I was in years ago where the management had a very, very firm idea of who they wanted, and then people that were going to be dealing direct with the vendor, they had an idea of who they didn't want because they said their relationship with them is terrible.
Yeah.
How do we persuade the management that we should go with someone else that we could get a better relationship with? And I was able to put that in the evaluation criteria, and I was able to sort of put, look at the weightings for it and actually get them to articulate in their scoring. And so it enabled everyone to be happy in the end because they and people couldn't, it was really, really black and white then. Whereas the problem they had to start with was how on earth we're going to prove to some of the management that we think that we shouldn't use this particular party. But by having that criteria written down and being able to clearly articulate the rationale and the reasoning made a big difference.
So having a clear RFP is really important. So what's the process that you use to write an RFP?
So finding out, the big thing is finding out how to, what vendors that will actually want to respond to your RFP. It's finding those names out. Sometimes that can be quite difficult. I know the public sector quite often advertise through certain portals, but the private sector sometimes I've seen it in terms of just trying to the types of companies that might be interested. Another company I worked at, they just had 4 major companies that they always went to, and they only would ever consider recommendations. So procurement quite often have their own sort of policies to use. And then when writing the RFP, it's then making sure that what questions do you want to ask. Non-functional requirements are really, really important because sometimes functionality wise, all the vendors might do the same thing, but it's usually your non-functionals that will really differentiate people. And what services that you actually want. Do you also want to include like hosting or support, and just making sure you've got really, really clear all the different things that you want the vendor to do and what your timescales which you want them to be. Make phrasing things more as sort of questions. Don't give too much away, but make sure you understand what you look for. So, for example, you might ask what their project methodology is. And if your company has got a particular project methodology, then it makes it clear then if they respond and it doesn't match with your own, that's an easier thing to compare. So they're all the types of things. And when you're writing the RFP, I always do the evaluation criteria at the same time. Obviously, I don't ever send that out, but you make sure you've got it in your back pocket so you know when you get the answers that people know what's important in advance and you've got a waiting for it.
Makes it so much clearer, doesn't it? So, Helen, you've done all this work. You've come up with a really clear RFP. You've got your evaluation criteria up front. You sent it out to organisations. You've got lots of responses back. What are the best approaches that you've found for evaluating those responses?
So if you've structured it in terms of the way I was talking about before, in terms of what questions. So normally I would put all of those type of questions. I'd put them as all different evaluation criteria to sort of show, so you can compare, each person can compare each answer and compare. With the functional requirements, you'd almost list each one, and normally you would ask whether they fully meet it, partially meet it, or don't meet it. So you can score based on those. But it's going through, putting all the stuff down that was in the RFP into like an Excel spreadsheet in terms of, all the criteria. And then you may have additional criteria such as existing relationships with the vendor. It's looking at the soft things that might be important. How easy are these people to work with? Have you worked with them before? Are they easy to deal with? Will we get a relationship manager? How easy? What's their project methodology? What's their escalations? What's their change process? So other things that might not necessarily be part of the functional requirements, but things around in terms of running the project when it gets going. Doing the evaluation criteria. One of the big things with evaluating is sometimes this comes into making sure you've got it in your RFP is trying to make sure that everyone, if cost is important, try and get it so that people get forced into filling out a template so they're all the same. That's one of the biggest headaches I've had when I've been evaluating RFPs is trying to have I got the exact comparison between costs. Because if you give them two different vendors too much flexibility, you'll get completely different ways of them doing things. So it comes down to if you structured your RFP to be very specific in terms of how they fill it out, it will really help with evaluating it. And it's like I said before, make sure that you've got the evaluation team agreed up front and the meeting's booked in the calendar in advance. And then you may want to have, as part of your process, you may want to have the shortlist the vendors and get them to come back in and do presentations. And then you need to again think about how you evaluate those presentations, what's important. So they're the sort of the things I suggest.
Brilliant. And you can really tell that you've done this a lot before from what you're saying. Absolutely. So Helen, how can people get in touch with you and find out more if they'd like to?
So if people just want more information, I've written a lot about writing RFPs and the process in the business analysis handbook that I've written. So it's a really good reference book. So I can recommend that. Or if they need some help and they want to get in touch with me, my business email is helen.winter@businessbullet.co.uk, or they can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.